So today we are going to follow the Chatham House rules. So you can reference things that you learn here, but I ask that you don't don't attribute it to a person or an organization. Why we are here today is to talk about the findings from this year's Data DevOps report. If you haven't downloaded it yet, I encourage you to go to dora.dev/report and do that. If you have and you loved it, please make sure you share it with your coworkers, your friends, maybe family. And once you've read it, encourage you, if you have not already, to go over and submit what topics you'd like to discuss about this year's report. We are using that to schedule out our Lean Coffee discussions into the beginning of 2024. We've already talked about code reviews. Now we're talking about documentation. So please encourage you, if you've not already, let us know what you'd like to talk about. We will be recording, as you see, we're already started. We will only record Michelle's portion of today's discussion. Once she's done, we will turn off the recording so that for the Lean Coffee discussion, we can just have good psychological safety. Feel free to talk about anything without worry of it being recorded. And with that, I am now going to pass it over to Michelle Irvine, who is a technical writer and on our DORA Research team, and who leads up the research that we do around documentation, and let her take it from here.
Welcome, everyone. So as Amanda mentioned, we are here to talk about documentation. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the findings from documentation this year, touch on a little bit of what this research program, or this part of the research program, has looked like for the last 3 years. And then I want to spend a chunk of time talking about how you can create quality documentation in your own environment, and how we can actually put this into practice. And happy to talk about any part of the research, but that's what I'm hoping that a lot of our discussion after this talk focuses on. So this is the 3rd year that we've included documentation as part of the DORA Research program. What we're talking about is internal documentation. So if you think about it, it's like the stuff that you're writing and reading as you're actually developing, testing, working on your product and your systems. This is different from end user documentation, which might be the formal like manual that you put out with a product, though a lot of this has tie-ins to both of those types of writing and just technical communication in general. So the documentation findings from 2023. We found that quality documentation has broad impacts, interplays with all of the outcomes, or most of the outcomes, that we looked at as part of the DORA Research program. So here we're just kind of skimming at all the key outcomes. So team performance, organizational performance, software delivery performance, and operational performance. All of these we see a substantial increase, and this has been the same across the 3 years that we've done. Some of these I think are new for this year, like team performance. But when we did introduce it, we saw dot quality interplay with it. This year, and same as last year, we're not seeing an effect with software delivery performance, which is surprising to us, but that's what the data is showing. So not a negative behavior there, but we're not seeing dot quality like substantially increase that. How is it doing this? Like, how do we actually see documentation quality driving team performance and operational performance and all of these things? What we think is, it's complicated. There's a lot going on, but a lot of this has to do with technical capabilities. Technical documentation is very tied to the thing that you're actually documenting and describing. And so we saw this for the 3 years. We've consistently revalidated this. Every single tech capability, process, practice that we look at, quality documentation drives that implementation of that technical process. So for example, automated testing in 2021, we saw dot quality driving that observability, like monitoring and observability. We see the same thing this year for all of the different tech practices that we looked at. We see documentation quality driving and impacting the successful implementation of these technical practices. On top of that, Derek, one of our researchers, dug into the data a bit more in the 2022 data And we actually see documentation quality interact with these technical practices as well, and they actually work together to amplify the impact on organizational performance, which is like revenue and customer satisfaction, among other things. So the numbers that you see here are actually the amplification effect of quality documentation. So, for example, let's take SRE practices. Here, the way that you can read this is you see this and you say, if you think about a team implementing from like 0 to good, like SRE practices, as you implement SRE practices, it has some impact, a bit of impact on your organizational performance. When you do that in the presence of quality documentation compared to in the presence of poor quality documentation, that impact is amplified 1.4 times. So documentation is like an amplification effect there. And there's a blog post about this that we wrote up for 2022, where we kind of talk about what might be behind that. I can link to it in the chat afterwards. And we see that across the board. So we saw that in the 2022 data. We see that in the 2023 data as well. And the numbers vary a little bit. Trunk-based development, 12.8 times. Like, these are orders of magnitude. So it's pretty wild. And the analogy that we used for that is documentation is like sunshine, because if you think about a plant growing, like sunshine and water, like they will both give benefits, but it's these things acting together that like really produce like a thriving, healthy plant. So that is all cool, and it was great to see it revalidated this year. So a couple other key outcomes that we looked at. So this is more well-being. And productivity, job satisfaction, and burnout. We also saw quality documentation interplay with all of these. So for all of them, productivity, job satisfaction, substantial increases when you're in an environment with quality documentation. And burnout, we saw a substantial decrease in burnout when you're in an environment with quality documentation. And I think we've got a stat here. High quality documentation leads to 25% higher team performance relative to a team with low quality documentation, which is pretty impressive. So I love all of this because I'm a technical writer and I know my work matters, and I have worked with so many people throughout my career who really value documentation. It's so gratifying to have numbers and to like actually see how foundational tech writing is to the work that we do. So let's move on to talking about creating quality docs. It can be really easy to think that documentation just kind of exists and it's a thing that you search and is there or isn't there. But the reality is, and I think that internal documentation, this is something that is maybe a bit more, you need to write it, right? Like the team needs to write it and maintain it. So exactly, outdated documentation derails productivity. And so when we look at documentation quality, right, like the measures that we use, it's a survey question. So it's high level. It's kind of like a black box looking at your whole doc experience. But it's like, can you find the information? And so, yes, it needs to exist, but you need to be deleting stuff that's out of date too. Like it needs to be constantly maintained and curated. So there's work that goes into that. So let's talk about how we actually create quality documentation in the environments in which we work. And also internal documentation, even if you are in a larger organization or you have the benefit of having a technical writer, the reality of internal documentation especially is that you need to be writing it. Like the practitioners, the people working on these systems are the ones with the knowledge, are the ones building it. So you need to be writing this content, even if you do have support, and it's great if you have support. So let's talk a bit about how we can do that. So these next 2 slides, where we'll talk about some of this, we did investigate some of this formally as part of the DORA Research program. So if you take a look at the 2021 report, we had a pretty substantial section there where we looked at practices that drove quality documentation. Another practice that we added in this year is formal processes to distribute documentation work. So please keep that one in mind as well. The next two slides, the practices, the things that we'll talk about, it's a mixture of stuff that we did investigate as part of DORA research, and then also things that are common practices in the technical writing world, and just like from my own career experience and from other people who I've worked with. So it's a bit of a mix, and I also hope that it'll just start discussions as well to hear about how you guys all do documentation work in your own environments. So different ways that we can create documentation, quality documentation. Oops. Go back. So the first thing, one way to think about this is like the skills. Writing is a skill, and some people may find it more difficult than others, but some people may have more practice than others. And it's a skill that you can develop and build and work on. So there are tons of resources out there for you to access. I'll link some. I'm more familiar with stuff that Google has, but we've got a great tech writing course, or a set of courses actually. And we do run, there are free courses that are run, but there's also, the courses all come with resources to facilitate it yourself. And you don't need to be a tech writing expert or have a background in tech writing to be able to facilitate it. Like the materials will cover that knowledge. So technical writing training, like, are you doing it? Is your team doing it? Is this available? And this, I would argue, will be beneficial beyond just like formal documentation, because we all write as part of our jobs. Like, we write emails, we communicate with our teams. And so these skills are something that we can build. Another thing to just throw out is peer reviews. So in my world, when I'm writing documentation, like, I'm sending the equivalent of a pull request, and I'm getting reviews of all of the content that I do. Similar to code reviews, like, you would need to figure out how to make this like fairly lightweight and nimble, but this is a great way to share expertise and to share knowledge and to build those skills as well in terms of documenting. Processes. Documentation is work, and if you can formalize that work and actually figure out what that work is and how to do it, then you'll do a lot better at it. One thing that you could do is you already have processes, you already have a job and things that you're doing. Take a look at what you do. Like, do you have a software development process mapped out already? If not, maybe map that out, maybe document that process. But as you map that out, like, where do docs live, right? Where are you accessing information? Where are you writing information? Like, when you're updating or maintaining a system, like, where does the doc updates fit into that? And where are docs painful in this process too, right? Like, are there parts of the process where you're constantly struggling to find content, or things are slow because the bottleneck is actually like searching through documentation or trying to find information? Those are good points to pay attention to as well. You can review existing like templates and other things that you have, or other artifacts that you have as part of your job, and see if documentation fits into there too. So here I'm thinking of, like, for example, design docs, right? Like, I mean, a design doc itself can have a template, but is there a section of your design doc where you are flagging like doc updates that will be needed? Do you have a process for actually doing the documentation work, and are you distributing it evenly? What does evenly mean? I don't know. It might be dependent on your context to a certain extent, but this is something that we investigated this year, and it did show a significant impact in doc quality. And it depends on the team, but sometimes I have heard of teams that maybe give documentation work to new team members because it's maybe seen as less important or easy, but this might be the hardest something for a new team member to try to take on. Like, some of this stuff might be more suited for like your team lead. New team members, in terms of documentation, bring a ton of value, I think, in terms of flagging bugs or missing content or lack of clarity, because they're the ones actually trying to read this and consume it, and they have fresh eyes as well. Create clear guidelines for updating and editing existing documentation. I would also say, oh, I've got that a bit lower, but filing bugs on out-of-date stuff or things that aren't clear. Define owners of the doc sets so that you're kind of formalizing your process. And then have process to file bugs and to remove content that's out of date. Another aspect to think about is tools and platforms, right? So like content management is a whole thing. And there are specific tools that we use. Sometimes they're very similar or the same as the tools that you use if you're a software developer. Like you might have your docs in GitHub as well. And so that process might look very similar. And then in terms of like the platform and how you're publishing your docs, like, is it searchable? Like, what are the pain points there? Who's maintaining these systems? Is it ad hoc? Do you have dedicated people behind the systems that you're using? And then just like any other systems that you're working with and processes, like what can you automate? Like, can you have automated tests for missing documentation? A lot of times that can be easier for more structured content, like API docs or anything generated out of codes. But you can also use other tooling to do automated tests for different parts of your documentation. Like spell check is an example, right? Like tooling like that, like will just like help elevate and make sure that your content is of higher quality. Testing of code samples, incomplete documentation. So like making sure that code samples are there. All right, what's next? Value. So a lot of people that I have talked to who maybe come in as one of the sole tech writers in an organization, they really say that finding someone who will champion it is very important. And part of what I'm hoping that this research does and gives you, this research, I hope, is doing this, but is also giving you the resources to like really advocate for the value of technical documentation. And so I think that's very important to be constantly doing. Another thing is recognize documentation work during engineering promotions and performance reviews. So this is a practice that we studied in 2021 that had an impact. And like this isn't separate work from engineering work, right? This is an aspect of engineering work, and it has a profound impact on the actual like system that you are building. You build better systems and maintainable systems when you're documenting it. And a lot of that comes from somebody reading the content, right? Like being able to get stuff done, maintain the system, but also, yeah, writing gives clarity, exactly. So the actual act of writing is a transformative act, right? So you might be building something differently because you're writing it. Also, side discussions or other discussions that might happen within the team that might have come out of the documentation or been about something that is documented, you have a single repository to go back to and update, right? So that those discussions or any changes and decisions, like then it's kind of recorded so that it kind of democratizes that as well. So recognize the work. Resources. So there's lots of stuff that is out there for you to use and that you can make sure that your team has. So here I've listed technical writing training again. There are also style guides. So we have a developer doc style guide here at Google that's public. Microsoft also has a style guide. Things like that can just be useful so that you just have a reference to check so that you don't have to be making your own decisions all the time, especially for internal documentation. Like you're not as worried about like your brand and your voice. You want to be like respectful and clear, and style guides can help with that, but you don't need to be like rigorously checking it all the time or anything. It's a tool to help you write clearer, right? You can produce templates for different types of documentation to be able to get them off the ground a bit faster, and then clear guidelines for updating and editing existing documentation. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on is technical writers themselves and kind of the technical writing profession. So when to bring in a technical writer can depend on the context of what you're working on and what you're doing. If you need to produce like that end user guide, like those manuals, I would recommend a technical writer or someone with a technical communication experience, mostly because like that's part of your product. And so there, like tone and brand and clarity like really matter. And also often there's a fairly big disconnect between your developers and like people building the product and your end user. And a technical writer is very good at that translation, right? Like they're there to write for the user with a focus on like the actual product and like what you are doing with it. And that's a difficult shift to get your head around. And so that's where technical writers can be very useful. Internally, it depends on the complexity of the content that you're managing. I would say, and this is true for external documentation too, like even if you bring in a team of technical writers, like you will still be writing like as a subject matter expert, but especially for internal documentation, right? Like you will still be writing and you will still be producing and maintaining documentation. Technical writers can elevate it and can corral it in a better way. They can help with the tooling and processes and all of that. And so that they can really elevate it. And then I also wanted to flag that technical communication is a whole diverse, like interesting profession in and of itself. And so if anybody is interested in exploring that, there are lots of developers and other people in this industry who do shift technical writing, who shift into technical writing as a career. But also, I really strongly think that it's a really good skill to have, an aspect to have as part of your portfolio as well. So even if you are thinking of, like, even if you identify as a software developer and that is what you do for your career, like, absolutely. If you have good technical writing skills as part of that, like, I think that just elevates you both in your profession and your marketability. So there's lots of different resources there in terms of kind of exploring the profession a little bit. And one thing I would say, especially if you're thinking about like pitching yourself, whether or not you're looking for a job, like even if it's just for like performance reviews or promotions, having a portfolio of content samples that you've done, and especially if this is internal, well, external too, like if you're job hunting as well, if you can kind of talk to like any impact or like a challenge and complication of that portfolio as well, those pieces, I think that can be very, very powerful. All right, that's what I've got